In this relatively short video, I'll discuss domestic policy in the United States. What is domestic policy? Domestic policy is a category of public policy that is comprised of policy decisions on matters affecting individuals within a political system. So what that means, these are policies that impact the individuals that are living within the United States. And typically these policies, they're directed at poverty, healthcare, environmental issues, and things of that nature, things to help improve the social and economic standing of people within this country. Under the umbrella of domestic policy, there is something referred to as social welfare, and social welfare is primarily directed at issues of poverty, more so than environmental issues or other things of that nature that other domestic policies focus on. Domestic policy decisions, those are carried out by the federal bureaucracy and all the various agencies that fall under the scope of the federal bureaucracy. And again, the federal bureaucracy is under the executive branch of the government. We could say this is its so-called fourth branch of government, but technically this still falls under the scope of the executive branch. What is social welfare exactly? Social welfare, it's a variety of programs meant to better the social and economic condition of citizens. So, some examples of these would be Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. We can also see unemployment or food stamps, so to speak, but that now falls under the jurisdiction of state and local laws instead of the federal government. Well, what are some of the goals of social welfare policy? We can talk about equality of opportunity, equality of condition, and equality of outcome. These three different things, and they're often discussed when we talk about social welfare and potentially affirmative action, of things of that nature, of just seeing what exactly is the goal of these policies. So equality of opportunity, what that means is, if we think about it figuratively, that everybody, they have the opportunity to participate in a race. Everyone can be at the starting line and start there. Equality of condition, though, that means that everyone, they can participate at the race, but when they get there, they also have a fair chance of actually winning. Equality of outcome means that everyone wins the race and that there are equal outcomes. Equality of outcome. Social welfare policy, it's not just about equality of opportunity. Equality of opportunity more so references to the free market or freedom, individual choice. We all have the opportunity to do what we want. It doesn't necessarily we have the means or ability to do so, but as long as the opportunity is there, that's all that matters. That's sort of the philosophy behind those that support equality of opportunity. Social welfare seeks to improve the condition of those at the race. It's meant to give everyone an equal chance and maybe to give them a boost if they're falling behind, and to give them the opportunity to be in the appropriate condition, to be able to have an actual fair shot at being successful or even having a life not in poverty within our society. Quality of outcome isn't necessarily the goal, although that is something that is desired. So the goal is more so equality of condition. But some people, from an ideological standpoint, I think equality of opportunity is enough. So let's look at the etymology of welfare. Where does this word come from and what does it mean? So we hear often people are on welfare, they're on welfare. Well, welfare isn't just one thing. Welfare refers to a variety of different governmental programs where one gets assistance from the government. And that assistance is meant to be short-term, and it's meant to be, it's very conditional. So there are conditions behind how you can get that money. And they're fairly strict, and it can be quite difficult to get this sort of help and assistance from the government. And a lot of people choose not to even bother with it because it can be such a bureaucratic nightmare to get something from the government, to get help from them. But welfare, so this comes from the Old English word welfaren, meaning the condition of being or doing well, or to get along, and it's similar to the Old Norse velfero, meaning the social concern for the well-being of children and the unemployed, etc. So this is more so the meaning that we use when we hear welfare today. It's this social concern for the well-being of, let's say, the needy. And it was first attested in 1904, meaning organized effort to provide for maintenance of members of a group. So it means we're all looking to maintain the well-being of our group. So the United States as a whole, we want all of our citizens to have a certain degree of well-being. What are some historic domestic issues? Over time, there have been domestic issues that have been brought up, solved, and sort of left to the history books, we could say. So one domestic issue was surrounding prohibition, this issue of alcoholism or severe drinking in the United States, particularly with men, the male population, and women. They got fed up with this, and they called for this reform to decrease, to completely eliminate alcohol drinking in the United States. This was seen as progressive at the time. It was progressive to completely ban alcohol. And we've discussed before how difficult it is to amend the US Constitution. But these people within this movement, this prohibition movement, they were able to actually amend the Constitution and ban alcohol sale and consumption in the United States. Slavery was another domestic issue, one that was cited since the very beginning of the United States, and it was a contentious issue that eventually led to war. Immigration, another issue that arose over time. It was more so in the 1880s that it became a policy issue. I think the first Immigration Act was in 1882, and this was the first sort of broad policy that restricted immigration to the United States, because it was sort of seen as this sort of problem that needed to be solved, or this domestic issue. Segregation, another one. An oil crisis in the 70s, or various crises that have occurred. Labor and unions that were created to address issues with labor. So there were many issues that arose as a result of industrialization and the workforce being exploited, and this was seen as a domestic issue that the government needed to address, but it ended up being addressed through unions, but also through the government, putting restrictions and being a sort of watchdog and policing of certain businesses. Health crises, certain pandemics. We have smallpox, polio, the AIDS pandemic, drug crises, the crack epidemic, and now we have the opioid epidemic. There are various health and drug crises throughout American history. The Great Depression was also a domestic issue, and FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, his public works, they really helped save the country with his so-called New Deal, where he created a lot of government-funded jobs and works projects that help put money into people's pockets and help bring them out of the Depression and make it so that they could sort of survive during this tumultuous period of time. So conservatives and liberals, they have different ways of viewing how social welfare ought to be conducted and carried out. Democrats, they are on the liberal side of the ideological spectrum, and they emphasize the government's response to societal ills. So that means that they think the government needs to be adaptable enough to be able to address social issues that are taking place and to solve them. So this extreme version, it states capitalism, it causes social inequality and poverty, and it's the government's responsibility to keep those problems contained and to act as a check to capitalism. So you have capitalism that might cause certain inequalities and potentially exploitation and poverty, and the government, according to liberal ideology, they view themselves as or they view the government as being able to keep capitalism in line and hopefully reduce exploitation and rise some people out of poverty. There will likely still be a divide, but through a liberal government and their ideological standpoint, they'll keep this disparity between the rich and poor smaller. Conservatives, on the other hand, they're characterized as being social Darwinists, meaning survival of the fittest. If you think about evolution, and Darwin, he had this theory that the fittest survive, and whoever doesn't, whoever falls behind gets left behind. This sort of view. That's maybe it's potentially true, but it's also kind of a caricature of what conservatives think. Another aspect of conservative ideology, though, is this emphasis on the free market, and the emphasis on the free market is seen as an extension of individual liberty. So it's not that the government should not restrict our liberty in any way, and if there's poverty that ensues as a result of that, then so be it, because freedom and individual liberty is more important than taking care of certain things like that. This is all purely from this ideological point of view. It's not that conservatives think that that poverty is good or that people shouldn't get some form of help. They just don't think that the federal government is the one that should help them. If we look at federal bureaucracy, these bureaucratic institutions and these organizations, they can be seen as very clunky and ineffective and lots of paperwork, nothing getting done. People don't want to bother with it. There's a lot of restrictions that may or may not make sense. Conservatives seek to sort of get rid of that, or maybe bring these policies to the state or local level, but even further to the family level or religion, where you have individuals, non-governmental individuals, that take care of poverty instead of the government addressing it. Teddy Roosevelt, he was a unique example. He was a progressive Republican. So at this point in time, Republicans were staunchly conservative, and they were pro-big business and industry. He realized that the Republican Party did need a reform or it would die. Because this was a point in time where ordinary people were suffering, particularly those in the working class, because they were working in factories that had really poor conditions, and big industry, they were able to do things without any repercussions from the government. So that would mean you might have food that isn't clean. It's not safe for people to eat or consume. So Teddy Roosevelt, he passed certain acts that made it so that businesses were required to have certain standards just for the safety and well-being of the American citizenry. So these are social welfare reforms that occurred. So we had the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 and the Meat Inspection Act of 1906. And I encourage you all to read The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, or to familiarize yourself with it at least. This was a book that exposed how horrible the conditions were in meat pack plants. And that is what inspired Roosevelt to come up with solutions to these problems, because it was clear something needed to change. People were being exploited, and this was not good for the safety and health of the public. So again, who ought to take care of the needy? So historically, who did take care of the poor? A lot of it was taken care of by churches. If we're looking at Western society anyways, some churches would take care of it, family would. But there were also societal institutions that were in place that pretty much took care of the issue of poverty and poorness, because these people were there were people in poverty or that were poor, but they were part of the system and taken care of by someone above them within the system. So for example, we have indentured servitude. So if you're poor, you can sell yourself and your services for X period amount of time to someone that does have money and work off your debts. So that's an institution. we go back to the Middle Ages, we have the institution of serfdom in feudal Europe, where you have the lord and you have many peasants that just live on the land, and you could say they get free room and board, so they're sort of taken care of by their lord, but the lord gets the surplus and the profits and the money, and he gets to live like a lord. So there's a huge disparity between the rich and the poor, but the poor are sort of taken care of by the lord, also exploited, of course. Slavery is another example, and it falls under the same sort of principle as serfdom and indentured servitude, where one is in a condition of poverty, but they're taken care of by selling their labor for free, really. Industrialization, it changed things quite a bit. Industrialization occurred dramatically in the mid-1800s. Really, it started earlier on, but we see the dramatic effects of factories occurring and increase in transportation and communication, more so towards the middle of the 19th century. And what this did is it increased the disparity between the rich and the poor. It started to tarnish the environment. So you have these factories that are, polluting rivers and the air and everything. And this led to unclean water and food, and it created social issues that previously did not exist regarding the labor workforce and society. So we didn't have to worry about the environment as much at a certain point in time, because before industrialization, it was extremely difficult for humans to pollute things to the point that it became a crisis or a social problem. So who takes care of the needy? So it was seen after industrialization, over time, after a few decades, say half a century, that it was the government's role to step in and address these issues that were occurring as a result of industrialization. And over time, the government's role has increased. The government's power has increased, the federal bureaucracy has increased over time, and the government's role in addressing domestic issues and domestic policy has increased over time. Less people turn to local places like their church or their family or whoever to address their issues, and they might instead go to the government for help if they need it. So here again, we have the chart of the federal bureaucracy under the scope of the executive branch, and these are all the various organizations and independent agencies as well that seek to address domestic issues. Most of them. Some of these do not deal with domestic issues. Department of State, for example, the Department of Veterans Affairs. Some of these departments don't really deal with domestic issues, but if you have a look, quite a few actually do. Department of Education, Department of Agriculture, Department of Labor. So these address certain policies that affect individuals living within the United States. So you can see most policy is going to affect us here, besides the stuff that impacts us, impacts foreign policy. The rest is all domestic policy. The federal government, there's actually a council called the Domestic Policy Council. And what do? I encourage you to pause the video here and read through what this Domestic Policy Council does. So their goals here, it says the DPC, they will craft and implement policies on everything from education to health and immigration, along with cross-cutting issues that tackle the profound and multifaceted challenges and opportunities before us. So it's clear that they address education, health, immigration, things of that lines, but there are unstated things that they look at as well, because in the United States we have a very diverse society, so there's obviously going to be complex issues that need to be addressed at various points in time, and this Domestic Policy Council focuses on those. The president appoints those within this council, so again, they're not elected by the people. The people aren't the ones responsible for electing those within this council. They're appointed by Biden. They fall again under the umbrella of the executive branch. The Biden administration, they have domestic policy priorities. Their top one listed is addressing the COVID-19 pandemic, climate crisis, racial equity, looking at the economy, healthcare, immigration, and restoring America's global standing. These are pretty broad categories, and how one interprets them totally depends on what side of the ideological spectrum one is on. So restoring America's global standing, that might mean something completely different to a conservative compared to a liberal. And same with how one should address the COVID-19 pandemic and immigration, healthcare. Really, on every single one of these categories, there's a pretty clear difference between liberals and conservatives on how to address these issues. But these are the primary issues that the Biden administration thinks that they need to address. So let's have a look here at the difference between liberal and conservative economic policies. Liberal policy, they are pretty supportive of taxes, and they encourage taxation of the rich. So there's this sort of Robin Hood mentality, steal from the rich and give to the poor sort of thing. You know, not necessarily steal from the rich, but more so to have a fair tax policy if possible. They believe in more government involvement. We can ask ourselves, can the government solve our problems? According to liberal ideology, if we just take the ideology of it, they think the government can solve all of our problems. We need more bureaucracy. We need more governmental involvement to solve certain societal ills. The conservatives, on the other hand, they emphasize fewer taxes, less money for the government to waste or what have you, and less government involvement, versus liberals who want more governmental involvement. So the conservative ideology says the government cannot solve all of our problems. The government has certain functions like security or monitoring or encouraging our morality, but they can't solve poverty, and they can't solve other issues. They can't solve everything, really. Liberals, on the other hand, I don't know if they necessarily think that the government can solve everything, but they definitely are more in favor of a big government. So what about other countries? What do they do? So some socialist countries, the classic one we hear about is Sweden. They have more social programs, and they have a bigger government that sets out to solve these problems. And so what that means in reality is higher taxes, but also more trust in the government. So if we go back to the etymology of the word welfare, it came from an old Norse definition that we as a group, we want the well-being of the entire group to exist. In Sweden, that's part of their culture. So Old Norse, this is the Scandinavian language. And it's deeply embedded in their culture that the community sort of takes care of each other, and they trust the government to be involved in that. They're not fearful or against the government. Americans, on the other hand, we're very wary of big government, and many people, we find the federal bureaucracy to be inefficient and ineffective. So we don't want the government to be involved in our personal affairs, and we're a lot more individualistic. Instead of looking at the community as a whole, we tend to be more individuals, taking care of ourselves and our family and our community. I say we, just meaning in this sort of broad speaking sense of what it means to be an American, and typically the trends that we've seen over time. Of course, there are people that probably fall more in line with the Swedish point of view, and they do trust the government. However, typically Americans are not that way. So how successful has social welfare policy been throughout time? It's pretty inconclusive. How does one measure this? So are we looking at outcomes? Are we looking at condition? Are we looking at opportunity? These are things to consider when we measure the success of social welfare policy. We can say over time, more and more money has been spent on social welfare programs, but there's still poverty, and there's still a huge disparity between the rich and the poor. And one might argue that it's actually gotten bigger in recent years. So how is this? How can this be when we have all these governmental agencies that are focused on eradicating poverty and closing the gap between the rich and the poor? How can this be possible that there's still this disparity and gap despite these concentrated, concerted efforts that have been occurring for the last roughly 100 years? We don't know. You know, there's a lot of research that goes into it. There are plenty of substantive documents that detail all the various ways that we can measure social welfare policy success or what have you, but it is difficult to say whether or not it has been successful. We can look at society and say people are doing pretty well. We have clean water to drink in most cases, but in a lot of cases, this policy has sort of failed. So it's sort of a personal decision whether or not you think it's successful or not. There's still inequality that exists, and we could argue that that might be part of the human condition, and it's still a question we must ask ourselves: how much of a role does the government play in addressing these issues, though? And is their role still as it was back during FDR's presidency, or has it changed over time? And we could potentially argue too that the government does have a role in addressing poverty and domestic issues, but maybe their role needs to be reformed a bit to be more efficient and effective.